no introduction. But I am
So you actually might be surprised. I'm always shocked at how many people have never heard of me. So
all those people are Googling you right now.
yeah, you never know.
You've had a busy 2
When I
years.
checked in, they didn't know my name. So I'm just saying.
Things
So
we'll
you
deal
might
with
not
later.
understand.
Yeah, we'll deal with that later.
Yeah.
Okay, so you have had a very busy 2 years,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
First, you come out on the scene as
Mhm.
the Facebook whistleblower. You're testifying in front of Congress. You wrote a memoir.
I was the SNL cold open one day.
I mean, okay, you've been really busy. You have a nonprofit. I want to time travel back though to that moment in 2021 when you were like, I'm gonna start collecting and saving these documents. What was the dream? What was the universe that you thought would come from that, and how close are we to that dream now?
Um, so I had very, very minimal aspirations. So like my primary aspiration was like I felt like Facebook had stolen my future from me, right? That I worked on what we called internally civic misinformation, which was misinformation outside the scope of third-party fact checking, which is the vast majority of misinformation, and particularly in some of the most vulnerable places in the world. And steeped in like what was going on behind the scenes, I really feared, and I still genuinely fear, I don't think we've done anywhere near enough to prevent my worst fears from happening. I worried that the ethnic violence in Myanmar, and by that time, Ethiopia, were not going to be the first, the full story on ethnic violence caused by social media. They were going to be the opening chapters about the legacy of social media. And because like we've been told that content moderation, like censorship, is the only path to safety, but people weren't talking enough about the idea that when you rely on content moderation, you have to rewrite those systems language by language by language. There's like 4 or 5,000 languages in the world, and Facebook at that time was doing any safety systems in maybe 60, 75. And not even comprehensive at the level of English. We're talking like at least one classifier, one content detection system in a language. Um, I very rapidly got like a graduate education in like tech policy after I came out. So I had never really thought about like what laws should we pass or, could we pass? And when I went to Europe right after I came to testify before the Senate, for 3 weeks, like we did meetings, 12 hours, 16 hours a day with governmental officials, with civil society groups. And people kept asking me, like, what should we do? And I would say, like, I think we should do blah, blah. And they'd be like, that will not work. Or like, let me explain how laws work to you. Or like it was real basic in terms of like going from 0 to 100 super fast. And the thing that I most intensely hope for now, like I've spent a lot of time contemplating on the question of like, how did we get here? What can we feasibly do to get to a different world? And I think if we pulled everyone in this room on like what is the problem of social media, we would get huge numbers of different answers. But I think the thread that ties all of them together, like the fundamental problem, is that when we designed these systems, not enough people were sitting at the table, and not enough different kinds of people were. Like we did not have any kind of democratic input. And a big part of that was that the social media companies, and this is not just Facebook's fault, it was MySpace, it was Friendster before them, it was Twitter. They knew that social media was different than all the other major tech products that had come before, because every single one of us, when we open our phone, we see a different version of Facebook. We see a different version of Twitter. Twitter was a little bit more open because they had the fire hose. Like you could kind of get a portrait of what was being done. But in the case of Facebook, the version of Facebook that even people in this room, or Instagram in this room, because this room is on average, I'm guessing a little bit more educated, a little higher income on average, comes from more socially connected people. Like you're not living likely in rural communities. You're not, like most people say they have no friends, right? It's a shocking thing. I'm guessing almost everyone in this room thinks they have 1 or 2 close friends. We have a cleaner, safer version of social media than almost anyone else in the United States. And so the big thing I push for today is if the way we got here was we did not get to have a single conversation, like a singular conversation around what's going on with social media. We got to have all of our own little lived experiences. We need to demand transparency. right? That means researchers need to be allowed to ask questions and get answers. That means we need public data feeds so that YouTubers can have like hot takes and like watch the metrics change every week, right? I will make funny videos about YouTube, about social media metrics if you give me data feeds, right? But we can't have that world unless we push for intervention from the government because it has to be mandatory. It has to be backed up by law.
Absolutely. So I want to double click into that because I
You
love.
want to hear jokes about social media data
I
feeds?
want to make the TikTok right now. No, I as a person who's defended journalists in my career, now I run a news organization. Transparency, of course, is for me often the first port of call for any problem. You got to figure out what is the problem so you can have the solution set. Now, one thing I struggle with a lot, coming from the vantage point of demanding transparency, often from systems like national security, is like, how do you balance things like privacy or competitive advantage or those other very real considerations that will be real for people who are subject to these systems and also at these companies. And so I want to hear from you, like, what is ideal transparency? Like, what does that system look like to you?
Well, I think the journey to transparency is a journey, right? Sorry, the path to transparency is a journey because, like, I think often when we talk transparency, we think the only option is like raw data access, which I think actually is a really important thing legislatively, but it needs to be relatively constrained, right? You're sitting outside of, a university, sitting outside of, many of these systems. I will probably not get access to raw data. But if you had more abstracted data or sample data, that might be a thing that is safe. And so one of the things that I've found really interesting in the last, 6 months or a year, as we've been coaching governments, as we've been coaching litigators, is most people are not aware that there are tiers of sensitivity in data, right? So raw, unrestricted data access, totally agree with you. There's like all kinds of, gives people the willy-nillys once in a while because, that is genuinely quite dangerous in a number of ways. But then there's things like, let's imagine social media companies had to publish how many children, so that's under 18-year-olds, maybe under 16-year-olds, are online at 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock, midnight, 1, 2, 3 a.m. Like, is anyone's privacy violated by publishing that data?
I mean, depending on the granularity and what's in
No, I'm
there,
just saying,
but there's a way.
I'm just saying
But
that's
just at that top level,
just
no.
that summary metric. No one's privacy is violated, right? You could even begin segmenting by some demographics, and you're still not going to have, like at a course level demographics, you're not going to have anyone's privacy violated. That's an aggregate measure. Then you start getting to things like top N. So top N is something like saying, what's the 1,000 most popular posts on your service? So let's raise hands in this room. If something is viewed by 1 million people, actually, let's put hands up. So everyone put a hand up in the air. If something is viewed by 1 million people and we publish it, do you think their privacy is violated? If you think their privacy is violated, please put your hand down. Okay. If something is viewed by 500,000 people, is their privacy violated? If it's viewed by 100,000 people, is the privacy violated? If it's viewed by 1,000 people, is the privacy violated? Okay, we're getting closer. It's viewed by 500 people, is the privacy violated? It's viewed by 100 people. So it turns out when you go and actually poll people, people say if something is seen by 32 people, people don't consider it private anymore. Like, this is the average person on Facebook. Like, this is one of the docs and the disclosures. People consider that to be like, if we're talking about our living rooms versus the town square, you post something to a space with more than 32 people, you're not actually trying to keep it private anymore. And I don't necessarily agree with that.
Yeah,
I'm just
how does
saying.
that break down contextually,
Oh,
right? Because it's
totally.
like
sensitive communities. I totally get it.
I don't
totally
care
get
if
it.
37 people see what I had for breakfast, but I do care if you're judging my outfit.
That's so the thing though is like right now, there are groups on Facebook with 5 million members, and because they are quote closed groups, right? You have to be a member to join. They can be open, right? Like you can join that group. Or anyone can see the content, but you have to join the group. Like Facebook has said before, like they'll never release data on it because that was a closed group, right? But that's ignoring the fact that most of those groups are closed groups because they want to be able to exclude people. That if you come in there and yell a lot, they'll kick you out of the group. And they can't do that unless it's a closed group. Right now, when we say, hey, this group had 5 million people, but it's private because you were a member, you're actually putting people in danger. Because that is not a private space. Like if you're sharing information, they're actually like, I'm safe. This is a private space. You are in danger, right? you can imagine coming in and saying, okay, there's some bar, maybe it's 10,000, maybe it's 100,000 people. And you say, if your post was seen by more than 100,000 people, is it not private anymore? And being able to start having data shared where you say, this is outside the realm of sensitive, or coming in and saying, we're going to randomly sample data that had public as the sharing setting. There's things where we can begin to get transparency into like what is the algorithm rewarding versus like what is being produced, where you still are not violating people's expectations. And so I think there's a bunch of these things where we need to have conversations on what is what we call the minimum viable queries. So I'm working on a nonprofit called Beyond the Screen. In tech, we have minimum viable products. It's like the least product that someone's willing to pay you for. We are doing a project called Standard of Care, and we would love to collaborate with people in this room on it, where we are making a taxonomy of harms. We're trying to scale up what Jonathan Haidt did around teen mental health. Say, let's do open literature reviews on as many problems as possible. Let's give them names. Let's give them ID numbers. Let's go through and say, for each of those problems, what are the areas of opportunity for preventing or mitigating that harm? And let's make it a standardized taxonomy. Because now that we have structured data, we can say, okay, of those areas of opportunity, we call them levers. Of those levers, what are the 5 that impact the most harms relating to kids? Okay, now that we have those 5, which of them impact harms to democracy? I'll give you an example on this one. I think one of the most important levers for kids is around helping kids go to sleep when they want to go to sleep, right? Because sleep deprivation makes basically all the mental health problems worse. It hurts kids' academic performance, which stays with them for life. It literally changes how their brains form. Right now, because it's a power law of usage, the 99th percentile on Facebook doesn't look at 20 or 30 posts. They look at 3,000 posts a day. If you make something that helps people go to bed when they want to go to bed, so we're not saying cut everyone off at 10 p.m. We're saying, let's use this lever. Let's try a bunch of different things, a bunch of different strategies for pulling that lever. Let's figure out how we can help people go to bed when they want to go to bed. I bet that 99th percentile on Facebook goes to bed an hour or 2 earlier. And right now, that 99th percentile, they look at 100 times as many posts as the median user. They leave 100 times as many comments as the median user. They reshare 100 times as the median user. They leave 100 times as much signal for the AI to pick up. And those same people, we've looked at what comments they leave. They're angry, unhappy. They're people who were doom scrolling at 4 a.m. If we help them go to bed when they want to go to bed, the rest of us get less misinformation. But you can't see those connections unless you understand the kids' problems and you understand the democracy problems. You can't see those connections. And so we think there's a big opportunity where by beginning to look at these problems in ways that have standardized interfaces, one, we can create opportunities to coalition build that are not obvious. But the second is we want to do a catalog of strategies for pulling each lever. So right now, often the people who understand social problems don't necessarily understand what's possible with technology or fully understand. So they'll do things like say that, one of the big levers for kids is let's keep under 13-year-olds off the system. Because they might not have as robust a sense of like what's possible, they'll say, let's check IDs. Often the most obvious path, the reason we don't do it is it doesn't work that well. But if you had asked a technologist, I have this area of opportunity, I have this lever, I need to find the under 13-year-olds, they would say, here's 10 or 15 different ways to do that. You don't have to check IDs. Some of it's as simple as like kids say, I'm a 4th grader. Or kids report each other to punish each other because kids are savage. Like, let's be honest, right? Like you were mean to me at recess, you are losing your Instagram account. After we find 1,000 or 10,000 kids, we can find all the other kids. And so there's a real opportunity there where once you know the harms, once you know the levers, you can start asking, okay, what data do we need to understand the magnitude of that harm? Or in the case of the levers, are companies using the opportunities available to them? Because right now, no litigator in the United States, no government in the world really understands the harms of social media in a robust way. I would say no one in this room does. I don't know. But once we have a common interface to talk to each other, to aggregate information, we can come out and say, we actually can figure out the minimum viable queries. We don't need to do raw. If raw data access is going to keep us from moving forward, let's figure out a smaller set of data that gets us 70% there. Because I bet we can get there in 6 months.
Now, when I hear you describe that sort of interface and those standards, as a person who's been an in-house lawyer, I'm like, oh, I can see why someone would not want that to exist because
Oh, yeah.
it is
Oh, yeah.
evidence.
It's totally evident.
But
Because now there's expectations. It's like you can no longer say, oh, we had no idea. We had no idea we should care about that. It's like, no, now there's a standard of care.
one question I wanted to dig into, right, is what's so fascinating about this moment is that there are more people than ever, I think in part because of your reporting, who do have this
reporting. I like that.
spidey sense that like something needs to happen, coinciding with a moment where tech companies are kind of flipping the bird to their internal teams, their integrity teams, their trust and safety teams. And it feels like a very funny mismatch, right? If I were a betting woman, I would have bet the opposite, but instead they're just ripping out the people internally that could do this kind of work. And I wonder for folks in the audience, if you could talk a little bit about what do those teams tend to do and what are the implications now of having those integrity teams, those trust and safety teams yanked out of these companies? And what does that do as a hurdle for some of the advocacy work you're doing?
Interesting. So just for context for people, trust and safety is viewed internal to most of these companies as a cost function. So you have profit functions, these bring in more revenue. Safety and trust has been historically viewed as a cost function. It's like it's a cost of doing business. Like if we don't, like people are going to yell at us because we, have hate speech on the platform, because there's child exploitative imagery on the platform. We need to at least be able to point at something and say, look, we're trying. One of the things that I think is so interesting about this moment also is now that things like the DSA are coming into being, or some countries are beginning to explore like what.
Do you want to explain that for folks just in
sure.
case everyone's not hip to the latest twists and turns of the DSA?
Yeah. Who in here has heard of GDPR? Yeah. See, the slow arc of history. Who in here has heard of the DSA? Who here has not heard of the DSA? Put my hands up. Okay, good. So Digital Services Act is on par with GDPR. So GDPR passed, I don't know, at least 10 years ago. I remember being at Pinterest when it went into effect, or we prepared for it to go into effect in like 2016-ish, 2017. And people like to say GDPR didn't accomplish anything. I remember being inside of Pinterest, and the person who was in charge of getting compliance with GDPR was like walking every team in the company through, what data have you hoarded that you are unaware that you hoarded?
That was my job at BuzzFeed.
Oh yeah,
not fun.
Fun. I don't envy her. Like the person at our company, it was one of these things where people didn't realize that they had, random engineers at some point, random data scientists had set up little pipelines, like queries that run every day, every month, whatever. They were producing some pretty sensitive things, and people didn't even know they were running anymore. Right. And GDPR really did change things in that companies became more intentional about what data they collected, and at least knowing that they were collecting things. The Digital Services Act is the most recent kind of generational law. So that was a generational level law. The Digital Services Act is the generational level law for online harms. And so there's kind of two schools of thought about how you can approach online regulation. You can either come out and say, we forbid specific things. We forbid certain kinds of content. Like if you post this kind of content, we're going to give you notice, you have to take it down. You have 24 hours to have something up. Otherwise, we'll fine you. Another is to come in and say, what were the incentives in place that caused the system to behave the way it did? Can we change those incentives? And in the case of the big tech companies right now and their trust and safety teams, the trust and safety teams are viewed as a cost center. I went, and before the the Wall Street Journal started reporting, I looked up every single time. I'm a data scientist, so before I go into detail, I'll be like, Francis. I went and looked up the stock price of Meta. I looked up the price of the NASDAQ for 5 years, and I compared and said, how often has Meta, then Facebook's stock price declined more than 5% over 10 or fewer days compared to the NASDAQ? And there were only like 27, 28 moments in 5 years where it went down more than like the NASDAQ did. And of those times, overwhelmingly, so like there were a good chunk of them, maybe 6 of them of that 27, 28, where all of FANG sold off at the same time. Like it was kind of overvalued, sold off, corrected. Of the remaining ones, the overwhelming majority, maybe like 75%, where some news cycle happened where either Facebook announced we're going to spend more on safety. So the largest single decline in the stock price as a percentage was in 2019 when they announced we're going to hire 20,000 more moderators. Or there was a news cycle that implied they were going to have to spend more on safety, right? Safety is a cost center. It makes your profit margins look worse. The thing that changed in the last year was Elon Musk came in and said, I have to make this company way less expensive. I'm going to fire all the people who I don't think are bringing in revenue, which was their trust and safety team, amongst others. And Mark Zuckerberg came out and he made this comment maybe 6 months ago. He said, Elon proved you can rip the Band-Aid off and there's no consequences. And by rip the Band-Aid off, he means you can fire tens of thousands of employees, many of whom are moderators, many of whom are your trust and safety, your AI ethics team. And then you can open source your AI model and no one complains. No, I mean, the margins get better. That's why he did, of course.
It's so interesting because the way to restore, if you are talking about a cost center, the way to restore the balance, of course, is as they were talking about in the previous chat, make sure they feel the pinch somewhere else, right?
Yeah.
Which is why regulation is so valuable here, potentially, right? You mentioned working with litigators. I'm very curious about, as a class of people separate from regulators, right? So if you have regulators who are sitting and thinking, what does the federal legislation look like, or EU legislation? You often have litigators who are thinking, okay, but on behalf of the people, right? In class actions and other things, what are the tools and levers available to us? What does that landscape look like for you?
Well, I would paint them as a piece within. I think we often blind ourselves to the fact that we are not actually kept safe by the government. I think laws are lagging indicators.
Yeah.
I had a memoir come out this summer called The Power of One.
We'll get to that.
We'll get there. Okay, good. And I write in the conclusion about the idea that we really like to focus on when laws pass because it feels so definitive, right? Like something has happened. But really, we go through a whole culture change process where what I call the ecosystem of accountability, and all of you are part of the ecosystem of accountability. But litigators sitting alongside investors, journalists, academics, legislative aides, concerned parents, all of those different functions are part of that ecosystem of accountability. And in the case of litigators, in the United States, for example, we never regulated tobacco, right? Like at the FDA level, the federal level. Congress came in and said explicitly, FDA, you can't do this. But all the attorney generals came together and said, we're going to do a unified class action lawsuit. And class action is not a universal solution, right? The United States has pretty good class action laws, but it's a pretty foreign concept in Europe or in, say, Canada, because they pass laws more effectively. They don't need other options. But one of the things I think is quite exciting is the Seattle Public School District came out, and other school districts have joined them and said, we have expended a phenomenal amount of money hiring more counselors, doing discipline, right? Like the principal from my high school said the number one thing he spent is, how is that possible? And he was like, there is literally a fight club, an anonymous fight club for our high school on Instagram, where kids pick fights with other kids while their friends film it and they anonymously post it. And he has to go chase down and the kids won't come forward because they're embarrassed. And so he has to go try to figure out who are the kids in the fight, discipline them. And when he talked to Instagram, he's like, I keep asking Instagram, can you take this account down? Like kids are going to the hospital because of this account. And nothing happened until I started using it as a press anecdote.
It's the power of public pressure.
Yeah.
All right. So we have just a couple minutes left, and I want to make sure we do talk about your memoir and something that I think might be helpful for folks in this room. We've talked about what companies can be doing, what advocates like you are doing, what litigators can be doing. We're in this sort of mosaic of how change happens. We've talked about a lot of people.
I'm gonna steal that language.
Yeah, go for it. Go for it. what I really loved in reading about the power of one is the focus on the sort of individual action, right? And what can, if you don't work at a big tech company, but you're a person whose life is governed by these systems, you're a parent of a kid who's subject to Fight Club, what should you be doing? What can you be doing?
What a great question. So one of the things I feel very fortunate about is I was a Cold War Studies minor in college. So like I have a tech, I have an electrical engineering degree. I went to Olin, which is like a tech engineering only school. And I am much more well versed in change movements from the 20th century than I think the average technologist is. And one of the things that I highly recommend people read is there's this long form essay, it's like 80 pages, called The Power of the Powerless. And it's by Václav Havel, who was one of the major leaders of the resistance, like the democratic forces in the Soviet Union. And he said, hey, it's very easy to be despondent living as a person in the Soviet Union, right? Like the Soviet Union is a place governed by ideology, not power. Like if you are a low level person, if you're a high level person, if you question the party line, the system will heal around you, which is actually an experience I felt I experienced at Facebook. Like if you challenged the vision that connecting people justified everything else, the system healed around you. They marginalized you. And so he says, like, if we live in the system where we as individuals cannot directly challenge the power, like what do we do? And he said, the reality is all change begins from the idea, the recognition that you are a human being, that you have value. And it's very easy when you're experiencing online abuse or you're witnessing other people being abused, or you look at the system, you say, this is unjust, like nothing is changing. It's very easy to lose hope. And it's very easy to like let yourself be devalued. He says, start by saying, I am a human being. Then care for yourself. Like caring for yourself is a radical act. Then care for other people in your life, right? Go and find the connections, build the connections. You can have that life of meaning, even if you're in a larger system that devalues you. And one of the things I think particularly, like I talk to a lot of parents, I talk to a lot of high school students, because right now it is very hard it's not possible for individuals to say, I want to spend more time in person with my friends, unless your friends make that same choice at the same time. And that's the thing kids are experiencing right now. Or like a parent says, my kid is telling me how miserable the system makes me. I want them not to do that. You can't take one kid, one family out of the system. And so the thing I really want to explore, and if there are collaborators who like this idea, because there's a limited number of hours in the day, and I'm not going to get to it for a couple of years, so I will freely give it away, is we need to start talking about network-based interventions, right? Good excitement. So it's one of these things of like, if we were going to go into high school, and instead of like, moralizing to a kid about how they need to have like better data hygiene or something, you said, okay, like how do we help kids make simultaneous decisions? How do we make them recognize the difference between individual and collective action? How do we make them recognize they're having something stolen from them, right? Like social capital, in-person communities are how we resist power. Like that was actually a big part of Havel's like analysis, was like that going out for a beer with some other people changes the world, right? If it allows you to say, hey, we matter, we are humans, we are here for each other, right? And how can we go and talk to kids and say like, hey, you actually have a chance to build a different future? And if we continue to be passive observers in our own lives, we live lives of scrolling instead of lives of drinking beer in person, or in my case, hard cider, because, gluten is a thing. How do we reclaim the right to be in person with each other? Because right now we keep allowing our in-person social spaces to be eroded. And if you live in a suburb, if you live in a rural place, you may not have anything at all in terms of where you can go and be a human with another human.
I think that's a beautiful place to end it, and a great opportunity to thank the All Tech is Human organization for creating these spaces and these communities. So thank you, Francis.